Jackson. Welcome to our 7th cottage meeting, virtual cottage meeting for Moms for America. I live in the Washington, D.C. area. I'm a mama of 5 children, and we've got Jessica with us today. Jessica in New York has 2 children, an 11-year-old son, a 9-year-old daughter, and Vivian in Texas, who has 2 daughters, a millennial daughter and a teenage daughter. And thank you for all those that might be watching or anyone that will be popping in. We're so glad to have you. If for some reason you're not able to watch everything today, we record. I'll let my doggy out. We record all of these and you can find them on our website. And so glad you're here. These cottage meetings are like Tupperware meetings, except we're not selling plastic. We're selling principles and ideas of freedom and liberty to shore up our homes. There's these little pockets of liberty all over America. Mothers meeting together for once a month or every week for a few hours to go through these lessons and to study other materials and ways in which they can prepare their children and their grandchildren to be a part of the solution and not the problem. How do we get our kids to know how to perpetuate these beautiful ideas that our founding fathers and mothers gave us so we can continue on with the country that they provided and founded and gave to us? And so that is what our cottage meetings are. We use a wonderful manual called the Cottage Meeting Manual. You can buy it on our website, momsforamerica.usa, or just go to Amazon. It's about $18. You can have the book the next day. There are 12 lessons in this cottage meeting manual guide, and we are on lesson number 7 today. So before we begin our lessons each week, and we're coming to you virtually because of the pandemic, normally the idea is that groups of 5 to 6 to 7 to 10 moms in neighborhoods would come together and meet and gather and learn and share and teach one another. But we're coming to each other via the wonderful world of Zoom. And I think it's just as effective, actually. I think there's pros and cons to both sides of it, but I'm glad we can all be here today. Before we begin our cottage meeting, now I've been attending cottage meetings for 12 years. We always just have a little prayer that the Spirit of God will be with us, that we can learn and the things that we need to be able to take home to teach our children, our grandchildren, and our loved ones. So we've asked Jessica if she would offer a little prayer, and then she will lead us in the pledge.
Dear Lord, we thank you for today. We thank you for this time that we've set aside just to study your word and study the history of this nation, Lord God. We pray right now, Lord, that you would just open our hearts, our minds, and our ears to understand what we'll be studying today, Lord. Also, we pray that you will just stir in our hearts, each one of us who's listening and participating, Lord, what we can do next, what the next step is for us in our own lives, in our own homes, with our children and our family, Lord, in our neighborhood. And we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, and we'll stand for the pledge. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Well, we are halfway through the summer. I think we're halfway through mid-July. Who knows if school will be starting back up again in the fall. Maybe a lot of you homeschool, but there's still a lot of uncertainty. But I think we don't need to be uncertain. And we talked about that in the very first lesson. If mama is anchored in hope, the world can be swirling around you outside your 4 walls, but your children will still feel a sense of peace and security and hope because mama is anchored in hope. And so the last 3 weeks, we have been talking about the pillars of liberty. How do we get those pillars deep within our children? The foundation of faith and the valor of virtue and the power of patriotism. I love America. I'm 51 years old. I've always loved America. And I think, why did I always love America? And I thought, it's because my mom and dad loved America. I saw through their example. I saw through them sharing personal experiences and telling us stories of, great people throughout history that were patriotic and biblical in nature. And that goes beautifully along with the lesson today, which is lesson on page 117, America Share the Story. There's a little Indian proverb at the top of page 119 in our Cottage Meeting manual that says, and Vivian, maybe we'll have that first slide. Vivian's beautiful 13-year-old daughter, Brielle, puts together our PowerPoint every week. That is amazing. It's a part of her summer homeschooling. She is fabulous. So, America Share the Story, the art of storytelling we're going to talk about today. So there's an Indian proverb that says, tell me a fact and I will learn. Tell me a truth and I will believe. But tell me a story and it will live in my heart forever. And that is what we are talking about today. How the stories have the ability to penetrate deep into that child's heart and cause their thoughts and their actions to be impacted. So our purpose today is simply that. Stories are a powerful medium to teach the 3 pillars of liberty, and it is the most effective method for planting seeds in the heart. During this presentation, we'll seek methods of restoring the art of storytelling in our homes. Now, we know as believing women that Jesus Christ was the master teacher, and he used stories and parables primarily to teach his message. The stories of faith and virtue and patriotism from our past is the bridge that will allow us to secure all the beautiful things that God gave us and our founders gave us moving into the future. A presentation of facts will educate the mind, but a story will educate the heart. It is really the core of human motivation and behavior. So let's turn the page to page 120 and 121 of our Cottage Meeting resource. And, before every lesson, they always give options for resources, additional resources that you can glean or purchase to begin to add to and build your library of freedom. So, I would really recommend each week maybe just getting one of these books off the momsforamerica.usa listserv or Amazon if you have a hard time finding it on our website. The very first book that they recommend is this American History Stories book, and you can buy all 4 volumes. It's in one. You can get volumes 1 through 4, and they're just multiple, like 1-page stories throughout history that have really primarily been lost, that aren't necessarily in textbooks anymore. And sometimes it's because they mention God. So those stories have been scrubbed from modern day history textbooks that our children might have in school. But this is a wonderful book, American History Stories. I've used it for years with my children. And also a part of the Freedom Series through the Library of Hope that you'll see down below is a collection of books full of stories written during that kind of golden age of literature, when authors wrote primarily to inspire patriotism, courage, and faith, and develop strong character. So the Freedom Series is a collection of 12 books that tell just beautiful stories. Like I'll show you a few that I have. Stories of early American history. So these are like the earliest, from the earliest of our founding of the country. Here's a book on stories of George Washington. Just small, like little vignette stories on George Washington. Look how many stories there are on George Washington. And the stories of the Pilgrims, and the story of Christopher Columbus. Poor Christopher Columbus, he continues to get battered and beat up nowadays. And so what you can actually do is sign up to get 1 book a month, and they'll send 1 book a month for a year, and then you can ultimately have the whole Freedom Series. And I think they're so inexpensive, like I want to say not even $15. And so it's just a great way to build your library of freedom, those books. Then there's a few more recommendations: Restoring the Art of Storytelling in the Home by Marlene Peterson, Read Aloud Handbook, and then of course there is the reading list that is on page 29 through 32 of this book that gives you 48 suggested books for kids of all ages. And then the Patriots reading list that's in the book Women on page 244 that has a listing of all kind of books to read for all different ages in your family, and videos and movies and online sources. So anyways, I don't want you to ever think, oh, what's a good book to read? There are so many good books out there, and it's just a matter of beginning to collect and build your little library. And you know, that's the wonderful thing as you meet together as moms in cottage meetings. Even when you finish all 12 lessons in this cottage meeting manual, because there's so many recommended resources we give, you will never have a problem trying to figure out what you should study next. There's like too many things to study, and that's a good problem. That's a good problem. So that Library of Hope, where you can get the Freedom Series books, is right there on the bottom of page 121. There's the website for that if you're interested in going and online and just checking out the various books they have there. So girls, let's move to page 122 of our Cottage Meeting Resource Manual, where it talks about how in the late 1800s and early 1900s, there emerged a golden age of literature. Authors of school books and general children's literature went to great lengths to write, to inspire patriotism, courage, and faith, as we'd mentioned. This time also sparked a revival in the art of storytelling among mothers and teachers of young children. The greatest generation is what followed. Stories are very powerful because while information goes to the brain, stories travel directly to the heart, and it is our heart that inspires our thoughts and directs our actions. Stories show our children what good looks like, what courage looks like, what faith looks like, what patriotism and virtue look like. So there's a great quote, and I know we've all heard it before, by Ronald Reagan, right there. Very good. He said, Jessica, do you want to read that quote?
Sure. Okay. Freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction. We didn't pass it to our children in the bloodstream. It must be fought for, protected, and handed on for them to do the same. Or one day we will spend our sunset years telling our children and our children's children what it was once like in the United States where men were free.
So, moms, what pricks your heart about this quote? What stands out in your mind as you read this quote by a former President Reagan?
I feel like we're on the brink of living that right now. You know, like in 112 days, one election away to potentially losing all those freedoms. It's closer than we know.
Right. I mean, maybe even a few years ago, I would have thought, oh, that's crazy. You know, we're a republic. We're the example to the world. But you can see how tentative our government, our form of government, the freedoms that we've just taken for granted, because we've seen how quickly some of our freedoms have vanquished in a matter of months. Vivian, what were your thoughts as you think about this quote?
Well, I've been having this discussion a lot, especially since our meeting last week when we watched the video of the making of the national anthem. You know, it touched me in such a way. I even made my husband watch it, and he's like, oh, I've seen it. And he's like, blah, 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 blah. And I'm like, well, I don't think you've seen it quite like this. You know, when finally when we get to the part about the flagpole, he's silent, and he's like, oh my gosh, you know, when I had my kids watch it, and I cry every time I've watched it, and I tell my kids, you know, they laugh at me about it, and I'm like, but this is serious. I said, our freedoms, we're on the brink of losing them And I told them my wish for them is for them to hear the national anthem one day and for them to cry, for them to feel it so deeply. Because if they don't, in my home where I preach this stuff all the time, what hope is there for other people if my kids aren't even feeling it, And it's scary, every election they always, oh, it's the most important election, it's the most important election. This time again, it's the most important election, and it seems because we're on the precipice of losing everything that we know. And with schools closing, with them wanting to keep schools closed, it's just a matter of keeping our students, our kids dumbed down, keeping them ignorant, so they're not going to be able to support themselves, to be productive members of society, and they're going to depend on the government. And it's just one more way that they're implementing socialism into our lives. And people, they're not even getting at the restrictions. I talk about the mask. I don't like that as a restriction. I don't like the government telling me that. And I tell my kids, I say next Tuesday, they're going to tell you have to wear green scarves on Tuesdays. And it's really coming now. We have water restrictions. We can only water one day a week, and it's just like little by little by little.
Yeah.
I mean, I get the water because we need to conserve. It's hot. It's been 109 here the past 2 days. So I get that. But it's just one of those little things that reminds me that the government at any time can step in and take away your freedom and liberty. And our kids have got to learn it. They've got to not just learn it, but they have to feel it in their heart. And I don't think they are.
Yeah.
I don't think they are.
Well, I think one of the positives that can come from our kids being home more is we have more time to teach them things that they're not going to get in the schools, and to teach them these stories. So let's be thinking about this question. Well, what can we do to preserve liberty in the hearts of our children so they will love America the way previous generations have? So if we could turn to Raising a New Generation of Patriots on page 42, at the bottom of page 43, actually, Raising a Generation of New Patriots. Bottom of 43, it says, stories are the means by which ideas are carried into the heart. And then on page 44, it says, Jesus relied upon stories. Consider that he only had 3 years to establish a faith that would transform the world, yet he chose to use his time telling stories. The fact that Jesus's priority was storytelling should give us a good sense of its power. We're not talking about reading stories together, although there is great value in doing that, and we'll talk about that later on. But we're talking at this juncture on this page about putting books down, holding our kids tight, and telling them a story from your heart. When the lights are low, maybe, and the children are quiet and in a receptive mood, the stories told to them will never be forgotten, and their influence will follow them. Your influence will follow them the rest of their life. Storytelling transforms a mother from an authority figure to a trusted guide and confidant. Don't you love that? And then the next slide, Kimberly, I love this quote. I've used it so much as I've gone throughout the country teaching mothers and speaking venues that I've had to speak to. The quote says, our children's ability to maintain hope during trying times is in direct proportion to how deep and how broad their reservoir of stories is. A heart stock full of stories provides solutions to draw from for every problem it may face. Stories keep hearts from failing. So, I have 5 kids, ages 25 through 12, and we would have a devotional in the morning, every morning before school, and we would study scripture, and we would talk about some virtues, and we would read and talk about some of the miracles of America, these stories. And so I've got this handsome 22-year-old kid. His hair this summer, oh my land, he doesn't have a good look right now. He's let it grow out. It looks wild. But you know, when kids are that age, you know, they got a new hairdo every 6 months. So his hair, I just saw him interviewed on TV yesterday. I'm like, that might be one of the worst looks I've ever seen him have. But regardless of the hairdo, this kid is a kid that grew up hearing stories of America. So in high school, he began to get some attention of some coaches around the country. He's a basketball player, and he was recruited by Duke, by Coach K. And I really didn't even know who Coach K was, but I began to realize Coach K is a very big deal. He's like one of the winningest coaches in the history of college basketball. So Frankie went, my son, my third son, or second child, went to Duke. And he grew up hearing these stories about when you're scared or when things aren't going right, you pray. So he's heard stories from the Bible. He's heard stories about Benjamin Franklin when the Constitutional Convention looked like it was going downhill fast. Benjamin Franklin evoked the power of prayer. Or when George Washington, when the Revolutionary War was at its very worst, went to Gettysburg and knelt down to pray when his troops were going to desert him, and he went and prayed and asked God, intervention. So this is a kid who's heard these stories. So I'll never forget when he was at Duke. He played just for 1 year and then was drafted into the NBA. He was going to play against the University of North Carolina. Now, I didn't know Duke and North Carolina have a tremendous rivalry, and it's always televised on TV, and millions of people watch the game. I didn't even know this until about the day before, and someone said, oh yeah, millions of people watch that game. And so after the game, they did well, they won, and he said, Mom, I just got down on my knees. I was so scared before this game in my little dorm room, and I just prayed that I would be able to, do what I desired to do. And then he began from that point forward to tell me the cutest little stories about when he went to the NBA Columbine. I don't even know what it's called. But all the coaches, all the general managers for every NBA team is there, and they're looking at who they're going to draft for the NBA. And he had fractured his foot, and he was playing on a broken foot. And he said, I went into the arena in Chicago where the Bulls play, because that's where all these boys were and all these coaches in the NBA were. And he said, I got down on that grubby bathroom stall, and I prayed to God, knowing that I had a broken foot, that I would do everything that I could, and I needed him to help make up the difference. And sure enough, he went out and he scored some of the highest verticals and jumps and whatever maneuvers that they do. And I just gotta think that it's just these stories that I told and Dad told in those early morning hours that I swear he slept through half the stories. I really think he was asleep in those early morning devotionals, that caused him to naturally go to his knees when he was worried and scared out of his mind and desperately wanted and needed something. And so I've seen firsthand the impact of these stories on this kid's life. And he just recently told me a story how he hadn't been playing much basketball beginning of the year, and he was worried. He wanted to play, and one of the assistant coaches said, Frank, you're going to get a lot of minutes this game. So he did really well. He had the highest points on the team that game, and he came out afterwards. I was at the game, and he said, Mom, this is what happened. So when the coach told me that I was going to play a lot of minutes, I went. And I think he loves to tell me when he prays, because he knows that makes me happy. So he's like, Mom, I got down on my knees in the bathroom stall, because there's the only private area he has. And then he said, after the game, I went back to that bathroom stall and got on my knees and I thank God, because he did well. He had a great game. And so, sometimes we think these stories are, and I tell you this, sorry, long drawn out basketball story about this kid with the crazy hair, that sometimes we think that these stories that we're telling is going in one ear and out the other. And I certainly thought that with my big macho boy that certainly didn't let on at, ages 16, 17, 18, that these stories were having any impact on him. But once he left the home and got into circumstances where he really needed the reassurance that all was going to be well, it was a natural thing for him to turn to God. And so that is the power, I really believe with all my heart, of these stories. So let's just turn back to page 122 in our Cottage Meeting Manual. And it gives us some beautiful scriptures. If we're ever in doubt what we should do, just turn to the Word of God. And it tells us, Vivian, if we could have that next slide of those scriptures. Which talk about, there you go. The one in Deuteronomy that says, take heed to thyself, lest thou forget the things that thy eyes have seen and depart from thy heart, but teach thy sons and thy sons' sons. If we don't continue to teach these stories, they forget them. They lose them. They become lost to history. Deuteronomy 6:7, teach them diligently unto thy children when thou sittest in the house, when thou walkest by, when thou liest down and risest up. The Lord wants us to continually be teaching. In Matthew, we're reminded again, all these things Jesus spake unto the multitude in parables, and without parables he did not teach unto them. I think that's what that's supposed to say. So, as we start to now turn the page and review some of our supplemental material, let's just keep in mind some of these questions. Okay, what are the benefits of reading aloud to our children? What additional benefits come from telling a story from the heart? What makes a good story? So let's turn page to 124, reading aloud to your children. Pamela Openshaw is also the author of this great book, Promises of the Constitution, where in a page and a half, she teaches precepts and concepts of the government and stories and so forth. Highly recommend getting that book. But she says at the top of page 124, reading aloud to your child is a powerful tool to bind people together and enhance their intellectual development. The combined sensations of speaking, hearing, and seeing deepen the learning process and embolden the concepts presented. So an opportunity and it also gives an opportunity to teach moral concepts, because as you read, then you have a discussion, you ask questions. For years in our little family devotional, there's a little book that our church puts out called The First Strength for Youth, and it's 18 subjects about values and morals: agency and accountability, dating, dress and appearance, education, friends, family, honesty, language, music, dancing, sexual purity, tithing, work, and self-reliance. So it's just about a one page. You'd read it in a devotional, and then we would talk about, well, what does this look like when you walk down the hall of school today? How are you going to implement this value? Or what's the consequences of not, being sexually pure? I mean, we were having these conversations we'd have them as the kids got older, but the younger kids by default were hearing these conversations, and it was interesting. Everyone gets something out of it based on what age they are, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. When you're reading good quality material, don't think that it's going to be over the head of some kids. The youngers will get what they need at that moment, and the olders will too, if it's a good quality book. And we're going to talk about that in a moment. So anyways, Pam Openshaw tells of two experiences of the impact of reading. She was a school teacher, Pam was, and she says in a third grade class, she'll never forget, she would read at the end of the school day before the buses came, a book, and she was reading Charlotte's Web. And this one day, they were on the last chapter of the book with just a few pages to go. And the classroom clock was ticking mercilessly towards the daily departure bell. And she was so fearful of stopping a page or two shy of the end of the book because the kids were just like riveted to the ending. They hardly seemed to breathe. Triumphantly, they sat immobile, mesmerized by the emotional ending. Triumphantly, she says, I finished the last sentence and looked into the eyes of the children, made tender by Charlotte's death and Wilbur's pain and consolation. And then the PA system blared its message that the buses were almost ready to depart, but not one child moved because they were so held by the emotion within that they were feeling. And Pam says, as I looked into the eyes of each child and I felt a love for each of these children that endures to this day, reading good literature has that effect. And then she tells one more story about, she has a large family. I think she had 8 children or something. And in the mornings, they would do their little chores, and then she would take 20 minutes, and 10 minutes, they would read the Bible, and then 10 minutes, they would read a good classic book. And she says she'll never forget the day, she said, we'd read, and then we'd end with kneeling and family prayer before we scattered to the 4 winds till nightfall. And that's kind of how I felt with my kids and our little devotional. As the kids started to get to be with different ages, I wouldn't see some of them again until 8 or 9 at night sometimes. But on this particular morning, Pam says that they had just finished the book Johnny Tremaine. Have you heard of Johnny Tremaine, that great classic? So he's a Revolutionary War young boy that goes off to fight in the war. And put that on your book books to get. And she said, our 5-year-old son, David, was sitting right next to me. And as we finished the final words of the book, an aura of reverence for Johnny Tremaine, for our country and its revolutionary history, and for our common familial bond, held us silently spellbound. And she said, it seemed like a full minute passed as we turned inward to capture the little feelings that everyone was having. And then all of a sudden, that little 5-year-old boy said, oh, Mommy, that was the bestest book in the whole world. Isn't that cute when, the kids say the cutest things? But at that moment, that's what he said. And then 23 years later, with that memory still fresh in her mind, I gave David, that now grown-up boy getting married, a new copy of Johnny Tremaine on his wedding day, and we reminisced over the power of that moment. Isn't that sweet? And it's real. So my question to you, moms, are what experiences have you had in reading to your children? Do you read to your children? Have you tried it? Has it been successful? Has it been challenging? What are some of the experiences that you've had or are having reading to your children or grandchildren?
No grands yet.
No grands. Assuming there's some grandmas out there.
Yeah, but as we've been going through the cottage meeting, I have been, doing some things at dinner time, taking the opportunity to read your page or two. And, it's like you say, Julie, and you come to my mind every time, as I'm trying to homeschool and these things, and you see Braille's eyes rolling in the back of her head, or not physically doing it, but, in her mind, they're rolling, she's not trying to show you. And we read one of the stories we're going to cover last night, and we talked about it, and it was a little difficult for her to understand as I read it the first time. So then we went back through it, and then she's like, well, let's do another one. Oh. I was like, really, aren't you kind of tired? She's like, no, let's do another one. And I was like, are you just humoring me? But I see that it's taking, making a difference and reading to her. She's a good reader, but she's the comprehension when she reads something on her own, she doesn't quite, so I think by telling the story and reading it together and going back and discussing it is really helping her in many ways, giving her these amazing stories, and
Yeah.
so I hope that, it imprints on her, and later we can have that moment where, hopefully.
What about you, Jessica?
I read to the kids as they were little, every day. I mean, they're 9 and 11 now, and my 11-year-old, he is a voracious reader. So he just reads on his own, book after book after book. So my husband, he usually will read to him at night, and he takes him through like the Rush Revere books.
Oh, yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's that.
That's
But then
great.
with my daughter, I read to her. She's not as much of a, she doesn't desire to read on her own, really. So, you know, last week I got a book from the library about Betsy Ross, and it was just a really cute children's book with beautiful illustrations, but connecting it to her and talking about it because she likes to sew, and it went on and told the story about how she was such a good upholsterer and seamstress, and how George Washington came to her and asked her to sew the flag, and she changed the design, and just kind of like inspiring her, look at, and she was just an ordinary girl like that just could sew well, and look, she sewed our flag, just trying to get her inspired. She doesn't love that I bring these books about history. I think she probably would like to read more about princesses or who knows, but we mix up the two, but
Yeah.
it's just, I laugh because my son, he'll say, Mom, I'm on a higher reading level than you. You always get the children's books about history, So it's like we laugh, but this is the way that we enjoy reading together. And I would say, like, during quarantine, people would say, "Oh, what's the first place you're going to go to once everything opened?" And we all agreed it was the library, just because my son during the quarantine, he had read almost every book of his like 3 times over because he could not get more books. So I attributed that to reading to him when he was young, I guess.
Well, and it's interesting. I have 5 kids, and some of them are voracious readers, and some of them don't like to read. So my basketball player was not a reader, but yet stories still impacted him, obviously, And so some kids, I don't know if they just brought from heaven a love of reading. I do think it can be definitely an acquired taste, but I think moms don't worry if some kids plow through books and others don't. You keep reading to them and telling them stories, and just so we have a 17-year-old and a 12-year-old at home still, and at night me or Al, my husband, still take turns. We sit on the couch and we have reading time, meaning they have to bring a book to the couch and read, or oftentimes I will read them still a book because I just want to make sure they're getting good quality reading time, which ties into what we're going to talk about next on page 126. Are you just reading to them? Gigo, meaning garbage in, garbage out. And so it says here, so much has been said about the importance of reading to your kids. And those of us who do can attest that it is a formative experience on so many levels. And it talks about all the things that transpire when you read: bonding, laughing, making memories, shared language, gratitude, reliving the past, pity and compassion, empathy for others, and it goes on. And so the author of this little article says she was teaching a little group of children with their mothers the traditional folk tale of the 3 little pigs. And she said, not the Disney version, but the one where the piggies actually get gobbled up because their houses were not made to last. And then I did what I always do. I began to ask questions about the story, and we had a discussion about it. And she said, to be honest with you, it took much longer, 3 times as long, to have the discussion than it did actually to tell the story. And so she probably broke the story down, just like you did last night, Vivian. You read it first, and then you broke the story down to help her understand that story and the miracle of praying and how God answers prayers. And he had a hand in preserving, these little colonies. So we have America today, or else, we could have been wiped out. The French were coming to burn the coast. And so miracles happen. This country was founded on miracles. Miracles can happen in your life, Brielle. I mean, and then you begin to liken it to them and their little life. And so she said, there's so much to talk about when you have a good quality story. And then she gives us some of the questions that she asked about the three piggies on page 127. Why did the piggies leave their home? Where did the little piggies get the material to build their houses? Does it seem strange that the man gave away the straw, wood, bricks just because the pigs needed them and asked for them without paying? Do you think the man would have given away the material if they hadn't asked? And so anyways, all kind of questions that she asked about this. Obviously, just any old version of the story doesn't provide such fertile thought. Some common versions are stripped of details that make this such a great discussion. This is why we refer to the classics, because they stay around for generation after generation and retelling after retelling, because they have more than just a bossy moral at the end. They have a myriad of open questions embedded into the detail. And then the author of this particular story said, not all stories are created equal. Not all reading times are created equal. It sort of brings to mind the computer science term, garbage in, garbage out. The common acronym is GIGO. It means the quality of output is determined by the quality of input. And haven't you really seen that? I have felt that the last decade with all the Barbie books and strawberry shortcake books and Disney books I've acquired over my 30 years of being a mom. And I'll read these little books and they're just fluff and stuff. There's just not really a lot to them. And so a couple years ago on my last baby, I'm like, I'm done with these books. And so for a few years, all I read her were books. And I'll just get my basket, like little freedom books. Phoebe the Spy. What's this one? Benjamin Franklin. Abraham Lincoln's Hat. George Washington's Victory. George Washington's Dog. I mean, just the cutest little books that I just have gathered through the years. So we put away the Disney books, and she just knew that we were going to get these kind of books. And she just kind of accepted it. When they're young enough, they just kind of accept it. And now, when I tell them that I'm going to read to them maybe a little bit more substantial book, now I'm trying to find the kids will just kind of take it because they just know that's how we roll. Anyways, I can't find one right now offhand that I want to show you. But anyways, what a difference that made. I mean, we can fill our little kids' minds with Barbies, but really, when every minute counts with a child nowadays, because we've got such a competing forces with their little video games and their social, media and so forth, I'm like, I want to give them a quality experience when I read to them. So if you turn to page 128, it talks about when it comes to family reading time or even personal reading time, moms, are we choosing materials freely available to us that don't serve really our interests, that aren't going to maybe be something that we could turn around and teach our children? Are we just reading fluff and stuff? Are we putting in the time and effort but getting inferior results? So it was interesting. About 10 years ago, we moved to a small town in Oregon, and I joined two book groups. One book group, we just studied the bestseller books of the day, fictional bestseller books. And they were fictional books. And then the second one, we were beginning to study the 5,000-year leap, these principles of liberty. And I found that the fictional book group, most of the times, I wouldn't even want to tell my children what I was reading because there were aspects of the books that I wouldn't want them to read. And so I thought, I'm going to stop going to this book group because everything I'm discussing in this book group, I can't really turn around and teach my children. And quite frankly, I don't have the time to study and to be a part of things that aren't going to be able to shore up my children and shore up the four walls of my home. And it was a real kind of formative period in my life where I just began to make of my time and what I engaged in kind of more of a lean thing, you know. So anything that I spent my time on, I wanted to be able to somehow use it within my home. And so I think that's kind of the idea of not only, you know, reading to our children, but the things that we're reading. Can we go and turn around and inspire others with the knowledge that we, you know, learned by the 6 hours that we spent reading this book? You know, am I going to be able to have a conversation that is going to lift and give people hope? And so anyways, so it talks about how parents, we can get frustrated and disillusioned with our kids' education and with the, like we talked about, the competing forces of the world. But we don't need to be, because if we read the classics, let me see here. Let's read this last little paragraph. When we're engaged with a great classic, I don't have to have 7 different lessons going on for 7 different kids at home. They each take from that experience something that applies to them specifically. In fact, my 18-year-old happened to pass by the parlor when I was leading the Three Pigs discussion, and she stayed to take it in. It was every bit as interesting and relevant for her as it was for the little 4-year-olds around the neighborhood that were there that day. And she commented to me afterwards, the 18-year-old, that she hadn't realized how much there was to think about in that story. My response, that the power of classics and mentors, quality in, quality out. So what, girls, are some of the quality books that you have read to your children, or that you remember your mama or your grandma reading to you? Books that you just never forgot or had an impact on you? Or what have you read to your children that you had one of those Charlotte Webb or Johnny Tremaine moments?
You know, I think I read garbage, honestly. I'll just be honest. I will. I don't, you know, I think, and not to bash Disney too much, but I'm glad you brought that up, Julie. And my husband, he's like, do you get the stories of Cinderella and these men are falling in love with these teenage girls? And I'm like, oh my gosh, I never even put that into thought. You know, Prince Charming comes for Snow White, and, you know, what is she, like 14, 15, 16 years old? And I'm like, wait a minute, I'm not reading these anymore. And you just don't even think about it, because it's just what you grew up thinking, and you don't critically think about those books. You think, oh, everybody reads these stories to their kids, or they watch these movies, and we no longer do that in our house. Right. And, you know, Kimberly Fletcher, our president, she sent these books out, and it's called Table Talk Sampler. Yes. And these are so great because they have 31 days of stories, quotes, and questions to spark conversation at the dinner table. So I find these really fascinating because, you know, when you have a teenager, it's hard to get them to sit down and to pay attention to anything. So I'm finding these little stories, you know, 1, 2, 3 page stories are really, I feel like I'm giving her good stuff in and not the garbage out, you know, because Real doesn't like to read. So she does love history. So trying to find those things, I think, is going to really help us and get away from the Disney stuff.
Yeah, yeah.
Jessica? I mean, do you guys ever think of that? Do you think of those Disney stories and how really they're truly inappropriate?
Oh, I think even the more modern ones kind of have a political slant that they're forcing or being pushed onto our children in a very subtle way. And I've noticed that the last few years. I'm like, I don't think Disney is quite the friend that we thought they were.
No, they're not. And you just, I think it's one of those things when you grow up, it's just what's normal. It's just what's passed on and generational, and you just continue to do that because you think that's what you're supposed to read to your kids. Yeah. So I mean, I hate to say I've been putting garbage in. So
Well, girlfriend, I had that awakening. Let us all have the awakening if and really analyze what am I reading in my own free time, let alone to my children. Jessica, what about you? What have you read any good quality books that you've had like a moment with your children? Or did your mama read you something?
I mean, I guess it's not anything in particular, but I mean, yeah, we're guilty of the Disney for sure. I mean, we are Disney fans. But lately, it's like, oh my goodness, what's going on, with Disney. But I mean, I take there I think there are lessons in some of those Disney stories. I mean, I always talk about Cinderella with my daughter and the fact that they were mistreated and they were still kind. They were still serving other and giving, you know what I mean? Like, and that's like when I look at that attitude, like I want to have that. I'll say a lot of times, like I want to be like Cinderella. Like I want to, even if people are treating me poorly and not kind to me, that I'm still kind and I'm still willing to serve others, even in that environment. But I still try to take what I can from it to make it a lesson to them.
Yeah.
But even as things change and even as those stories maybe become garbage, I still use that to teach them. Like, okay, now what do we think here?
Right.
This doesn't seem right, does it?
Well, you can always correct. Yeah,
Yeah,
if something in the show wasn't quite right, then that's your opportunity to
right,
refute it.
right. And I'll try to teach them like so that they can decide on their own in the future. So, whether it's descendants, like that's one of the Disney things. I would tell my daughter, okay, now it's about the villains, and now the villains are glorified and the princesses are bad. I said, this is what, I don't want to scare my kids, but I'll say, this is what Satan does. Like he wants to take what's good and make it bad, and take what's bad and make it good. And it's happening here. And they're just sneaking it in, but I want you to see this because as you get older and you see other things, I want you to be aware of it. So yes, I agree. I don't want to take the garbage in and have them take the garbage out, but if they do see the garbage, point it
Right.
out and say, do
Right.
you see this?
Yeah.
This is what's happening here, and make a lesson out of that.
Yeah.
Yeah, because you can always, you're right, Jessica, because you can turn those things into the teaching moment,
Yeah.
Exactly.
So, but you just got to realize that's a teaching moment that you may not even realize you need to be teaching,
Right.
Well,
in a
and
different
sometimes,
way. And I just take it at face value of the story.
Mhm.
yeah, and sometimes that means we have to be watching what they're watching, or else we
Right.
really don't know what is being fed to them, and so that's something you have to be prayerful about, how limiting their access, to primetime TV or Disney Channel or whatnot. But I remember a few years ago watching Disney Channel, thinking Disney Channel is not a mother's friend,
All the parents are stupid and the
Right.
kids get away, around everything. Or you have like iCarly who has no parental supervision. They're
Right.
just running.
Right.
Disney's not our friend.
Yeah. So, I remember my mama reading a book called The Boxcar Children. Do you remember
Love
that?
that series.
Yeah. I mean, that's one of those that you're just like, oh, or my kids, now they're 25, 22, 20, will go, Mom, I remember we'd go to this beach house every year and you'd sit outside the door and you read to us Little Women, all the little Women on the Prairie, Little House on the Prairie book. And every Christmas, A Christmas Carol, Scrooge, the wonderful lessons from that book. And so, you think that, and those kids at that point, some of them were well into their teenage years, and so once again, it's amazing what they will remember, but at the time you're doing it, they're like, oh, Mom, please, I don't want, I mean, they'll do every sort of resistance. And that's why you just have to be firm and you have to be consistent, even when they're rolling their eyes. As you consistently do something over a matter of a week, a month, 6 months, then they don't complain anymore. They just know that's just the drill in this house. That's just what we do. And then a few years down the road, after they leave the home, they go, Mom, remember when you used to read to us? And I'm like, it's so gratifying. But I'm telling you, there's about a decade during those 12 to 18-year-old teenage years that they're not hardly giving you back any good feedback. They're just typically not. And so you just have to go on faith with these principles that we're studying today. So, the next couple pages are just a bunch of great stories that they used to be in the grammar school textbooks, and they're well documented, but they've been removed from a lot of the history books because they contain religious or other content that isn't desirable for textbooks in the schools anymore, which is such a shame. So if you just turn to page 130, it talks about the miracle at Boston. That's the story that you read last night, Vivian. So good. God hears and answers prayers. And then the faith of Columbus story. I mean, Columbus, I don't know if there's going to be a statue left of him after all this is transpired right now in our country in 2020. But people don't know the true story of Christopher Columbus. So you get little books like this, or you get the light and the glory that talks about Christopher Columbus at a young age. An angel of God appeared to him and said, "Other sheep I have which are not of this fold." In John 10:16, I want you to take God to the world. And so this is why he did what he did. Now that is completely lost to modern day historians. And so, turning the page, there's the cutest story. If we could have that picture of Kayla Rosie, about the cutest story on page 132 about a girl named Elizabeth who saved little Fort Henry during the Revolutionary War, the 42 people that were in this fort by her courage. There was 500 Indians and British troops that were bombarding the fort, and the people within the fort, the little American colonists, ran out of gunpowder, and they left the other gunpowder in a home right outside the fort. So she had the courage to go out that gate and run and get that gunpowder and bring it back. And they were able to, hold off everyone until other reinforcements came, and her little courage saved that fort. And so, if you read the story, you would go, what is the difference that one girl made? What is the difference? What's the difference, honey, that you can make? And this is my daughter who is married now. She's 25, Kayla Rose, and she served a mission for our church 1.5 years in the Amazon River. And it was hard. And she would be able to call just a couple times a year, and she would write little letters, and I could tell, she was teaching the gospel of Jesus Christ, but in a third world country where there were muddy roads and lice and bugs and rodents and jungle fever. And she will say, "Mom, I so many times wanted to come home." But she said, "I remember that picture of Mount Vernon on our mantle, and you telling that story about every other week in the family devotional, how George Washington stayed the course during the miserable 8 years in the Revolutionary War and 8 years as president, when really all he wanted to do was just come home to his Mount Vernon and his land and his family. But because he stayed the course, it made all the difference for me today and this nation." And she said, "I just remember that story of George Washington, that maybe if I stay the course, it might make all the difference to one person." And so, it just touched my heart when she told me that story. And it's because the stories that I told her rooted her in a difficult time when she just wanted to come home. I love this quote here: "When the world is in chaos and not able to locate its identity, or when a child is in chaos and just wants to come home, it's the storytellers that bring it back, bring the child back to the center." So maybe it was the stories that we told, to her in those early morning devotionals, because storytellers are the keepers of the culture. So girls, let's just turn real quick to page 123 of our cottage meeting. And we won't go through them, but it gives great, on page 123 in the middle, the Promises of the Constitution has some great little stories about the miracle of Boston, the faith of Columbus, the gunpowder story. I'm sorry. the 2.5, the vignettes, stories about life after the Puritans, the miracle of the cannon, the battle for Boston, the miracle of Long Island, the miracle of the fog, the miracle of Trenton and Princeton, and the miracle of Valley Forge. Great little vignettes. So what I'm doing is just loading you down with a bunch of resources today, a bunch of stories that you can turn to instead of just always be the default mode at Disney. And believe me, my kids, we had all the Disney videos. They know all the words to the Lion King and blah, blah, blah. But, you know, we just kind of in the back of our minds need to be mindful of, am I giving them the best material, the best experience they have? Because when they leave that house, they're going to need these rootings when the storms hit. And is Disney going to give them those rootings? Maybe some of them have, but I dare say these classics that we discuss might be more powerful and effective in their life. So before we end today, does anyone have anything they want to add to our discussion? Thank you so much for all that you've commented thus far today.
Julene, we have Nellie Riggs. She's watching and she's wanting to know what the devotional from your church was called.
Oh, so it wasn't really from my church. It's just a devotional I felt like I needed for my children. And the devotional, when they were little, I did it differently. I just held up a little picture from the Bible and just told them the story. We'd sing a little gospel song they learned in Bible school, and then we'd pray. That was the devotional.
No, I think the little book that you showed earlier.
Oh, for the strength of youth. This one? Yeah. And this was very good for teenagers because it would talk about, why do we dress modestly? Why do we listen to uplifting music? Why do we not curse and swear? You know, why does the kind of friends we have make a difference on what kind of person we are, you know? And so it was a great little book. So you can get it. Let's see, how would you get the strength of youth? Kimberly or Vivian, if anyone would text me, I could figure out a way to get you one of these books so easily.
Okay, yeah, I asked her to. She doesn't have any audio, but she said yes, that's it. If she, Nellie, if you send me your address to Vivian@momsforamerica.us, we'll get you a copy of that.
Yeah, and even if you Google for the strength of youth, I know they're free. You can get them online for free, actually, I believe. So if you Google it, or you even if Vivian, if there's some way that you would want to give her my cell phone, we could just text back and forth, and I could just walk you through how to get it. I would recommend nowadays, if you just Google anything, you can figure out how to get it for the strength of youth, though. And so that was an effective tool that I used with my teenagers. So anyways, anyone else have any parting shots or words before you? Well, you know, really, you've seen today that this lesson manual alone is chock full of stories, inspiring stories. And I mean, I can't tell you how many years I would hold this on my lap in the morning in my pajamas and read little vignettes and little stories from this book. But I really do believe that, you know, it's these stories that will travel to their little hearts, and it will inspire them in their hours of need when they need to have the courage to rise up, to speak up, or to make the right choices, or to do the hard thing. And it will be the means of them knowing how they can preserve this land of liberty that has been given to us by our beautiful founding mothers and fathers. So, all right. We did it, girls. Another lesson down.
Thank you so much, Jolene.
Oh, happy reading. Have a great week.
Bye-bye.
Bye.